Thank you so much, Professor Zakarian and Professor Maghakyan. Thank you, community, Fresno faculty, and students, for the opportunity to return to you, albeit this time via Zoom. I appreciate the university and the Armenian Studies Department accommodating the circumstances that my family is dealing with, because of which I'm unable to be with you in person. But I'm very glad to continue this important conversation about Armenian heritage in Turkey. And today we will talk about the present of the past, the state of the Armenian heritage in Turkey during the Erdogan regime. I do want to start today's presentation with some positive news. As some of you may have seen in social media or in news outlets, today, a university in Germany that's working with the National Academy of Sciences in Armenia announced the discovery of the oldest documented church in Armenia, dating from the mid-300s, belonging to an architectural style that has never been discovered in Armenia or in nearby areas. Those churches, this 8-pillared or 8-cornered churches, do exist in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they have not been discovered in Armenia. Until today, we thought that the earliest Armenian churches were basilicas, the rectangular buildings built in Yereruyk and in other places. But for the first time, we know that the earliest known churches outside the home-like assembly areas used by the earliest Christians, that the very earliest forms of Christian architecture has been used in Armenia, and the discovery was announced today. It's a major discovery. And the reason why I'm sharing this, it's not only to share good news, but talk about the importance of the topic today and the importance of seeking solution to preserving and understanding Armenian culture, because this site is located next to the Turkish border. If you can see in the satellite image, we're looking at the ruins of the Artaxiat or Artashatsian capital of Armenia, Artashat, and it's located immediately next to the Turkish-Armenian border, which means that it requires considerable work, indirect work, between Armenian specialists and Armenian and Russian border guards, but also the Turkish border guards. And it's obvious that this ongoing excavations by a German Armenian crew would not have been possible without some sort of agreement with the Turkish government. And if you want to look closer at it, you may see the border guard tower, and the last shadow that it casts on the satellite image right in the middle of the archaeological site, pinpointing the complex security arrangement and anxieties that exist in the region. Yet an accommodation has been made that has allowed for the discovery of this very important archaeological site, the discovery of which was announced today. So today's talk will be forward-looking, although the last talk of this will be even more specific to finding solutions. But I do want to summarize in just 3 slides what we talked about last time we met, and that's the past of the past. And the way we know about the inventory of the sacred Armenian material past in what is today Turkey, including through this 17th century map, one of the oldest maps in the world, that documents at least 800 major churches at that period throughout the Armenian world. In our previous presentation, we also looked at a heartbreaking report publicized by Johannes Lepsius that talked about the destruction of Armenian churches that happened during the Armenian or the Hamidian massacre against Armenian populations throughout the Ottoman Empire, that saw looting and destruction of about 2,500 villages and towns, and looting and destruction of hundreds of churches, and conversion of 300 churches. It's important to keep in mind, as we discussed last time, that Armenians continued rebuilding, although there was never full rebuilding. And then in 1911, just years before the Armenian genocide, Archbishop Maghakyan Armenian, and at some point Patriarch, he was able to summarize the number of churches under the Patriarchate of Constantinople and under the Catholic state of Cilicia or Kilikia, putting the total number of about 2,000 churches that were functioning. Now, we know that most of these have been damaged or destroyed to a degree. And while this discussion is forward-looking, because we're not just here to lament the loss and to decry and name and shame the perpetration of this state-sponsored heritage crime, we are forward-looking, but I think it's important that we summarize and understand where we are. And I could do it with many more slides, or I can borrow the words of one of the best writers of our time, William Dalrymple, who is a very, very well-known Scottish writer. He writes a lot about Indian history and British conquests. You're probably familiar with some of this work. One of his earliest works is From the Holy Mountain. And if you have not read it, you should, at least the pages that talk about the destruction of Armenian heritage. I'm going to read it. It might be a little lengthy, so I'll try to stop and discuss parts of it. William Dalrymple writes in 1994, seeing what had happened in the last few months to the Armenian churches of Edessa or Urfa and Diyarbakir or Tigranakert, one in the process of being converted into a mosque, the other collapsing into a state of ruthless ruination. This is about Surgiragos, which has been restored, reminded me of my first encounter with the increasingly rapid disappearance of Turkey's Armenian heritage. In the summer of 1987, writes Dalrymple, a year after following Marco Polo's route from Jerusalem to Xanadu, I returned to eastern Turkey to fill out my notes on the region before setting about writing a book on the journey. The previous year, I'd spent a happy afternoon in Sivas, admiring the old Seljuk colleges there, and had noticed that in front of the Shifaye Medrese, there lay a most unusual graveyard where tombstones inscribed in Ottoman Turkish, Armenian, and Greek were all jostled together side by side. On reflection, I decided it must actually have been a lapidarium or sculpture garden rather than an ecumenical graveyard, for no period have Muslims and Christians ever been buried side by side. But whatever it was, whenever I returned, next time I returned, the Armenian stones had all disappeared. The removal of perhaps 15 heavy slabs and memorials would have been a considerable operation. And it had clearly taken place very recently, for the grass was still depressed and discolored where they had rested. But when I asked the custodian where they had gone, he resolutely denied that any such stones had ever existed. I could probably have persuaded myself that I was mistaken and that the stones were my own invention had I not actually written quite full descriptions of them in my notebooks the previous year. It was all, he writes, very strange. And then he describes going to Erzincan or Yerzanka, to Erzurum, where his cousin was working as an agricultural engineer. He shares the story, and the cousin tells him a very, very similar experience. And so I'm moving forward to the end of that. Government official from Erzurum had come through the village the previous month that asked the villagers for the whereabouts of any Armenian antiquities and then proceeded to smash the stones up. Afterwards, they had carefully removed the rubble. And then he goes on to write, I'd heard other similar stories of the mysterious disappearance of Armenian remains. And the following year, which would be 1988, working as a journalist for The Independent, I was able to investigate the subject in some detail. The trail led from the Armenian community in Paris through Anatolia to the library of the Armenian community in Jerusalem. By the end, I had amassed a body of evidence which showed the alarming speed at which the beautiful, ancient, and architecturally important Armenian churches of Anatolia were simply vanishing from the face of the earth. And then he goes on to describe the loss as his research had unveiled. An incomplete inventory of actively used Armenian churches compiled by the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople in 1914, which we already showed in the previous slides, recorded 210 Armenian monasteries, 700 monastic churches, and 1639 parish churches, a total of 2,549 ecclesiastical buildings. And then he mentions a survey, which is from UNESCO of 1974, where it's showing that 913 buildings whose locations were still known found that 463 had completely disappeared, 252 were in ruins, and only 197 remained in any sort of sound condition. And this is 1974, and many things have changed since. Interestingly enough, and I'm skipping a few passages, then Dalrymple goes in to describe the looting, which is much more prominent today, 30-some years later, than it was at the time of the writing. But he does a very good job describing why this looting is taking place. There was nothing very sinister in the cause of the condition of many of the buildings. Some had been damaged by earthquakes, and the explosion of Turkey's population had caused a demand for building materials. So it's trying to be balanced here, but then he goes into detail, which the church is readily supplied. Others have been fatally undermined by Turkish peasants digging for, quote, Armenian gold, the legendary El Dorado of riches supposedly buried by Armenians before they are, quote, deported in 1915. Nevertheless, he writes, it was clear that the Turkish antiquity authorities had not exactly gone out of their way to stop the Armenian monuments from falling into decay. And he goes on and gives several wonderful examples, including French researchers being detailed, but one is particularly striking, and I want to read that one. Fear of this sort thing severely restricts the investigation of Armenian remains and leads to a kind of selective blindness in those scholars whose professional careers demand that they continue to work in Turkey. Then he talks about how a hydroelectric scheme required the removal of cultural monuments, and pay a very close attention. 5 buildings at the Kazan Dam near Elazig, 5 buildings were of particular importance. This is in the 1960s. A pair of fine Ottoman mosques, a small Syrian, should be Syriac Orthodox church, and 2 Armenian churches, one of which contained exceptional 10th century frescoes. The rescue operation is recorded in the Middle East Technical University Kazan project proceedings, so this is his research. The report describes how the 2 mosques were moved stone by stone to a new site. The Syrian Orthodox Church was surveyed and excavated, so at least the Syriac Church or the Assyrian Church was studied. The 2 Armenian churches were completely ignored. Although the most ancient and perhaps the most interesting of the threatened monuments They did not even receive a mention in the report. They now lie forever submerged beneath the waters of the lake. And then he goes on to describe other instances of erasure. Now, it's important, as Dalrymple points out, to realize that there were periods during heightened authoritarianism in Turkey, as well as heightened security fears that contributed to the destruction. And this is the last passage that I'll read. During the 1970s and early 1980s, it was clear, he writes, that the censorship of publications dealing with the Armenians had been dramatically stepped up. The reason for this was the rise of Asala, according to the author, the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, which in the early 80s began attracting international attention with a series of terrorist attacks, he writes, directly mainly at Turkish diplomats. The resulting publicity succeeded in bringing the issue of the Armenian genocide back onto the political agenda. This culminated in 1987 in the passing of a resolution in the European Parliament recognizing the Armenian genocide. But then he goes on to describe how also the security fears and the rising authoritarianism and waves of coups in Turkey were also an important part of the destruction. And the reason why I took the time to read in detail how Dalrymple summarizes is to bring us to today, which of course went through the period of Armenia becoming an independent state, and then having the war with Azerbaijan that made relations with Turkey even harder. But then something changed in 2003 when Erdogan, the current leader of Turkey, and his AKP party came to power. They created a more or less moderate coalition. And one of the first things that Erdogan did early on in his presidency was to renovate the 10th century cathedral of Surpkhaj on the lake of Akhtamar, on the island of Akhtamar in Lake Van. Surpkhaj, as we know, is one of the most important churches, and we'll look at some pictures a little later on. But he started with this, token renovation, which, some Armenian circles criticized as too little, too late, but others welcomed it as the right move. The patriarchate in Constantinople or in Istanbul did not like that it would be opened as a museum, although an Armenian service is permitted once a year. Regardless of the politics and the reaction from different parts of the Armenian community, it was somewhat successful, renovation. There have been some criticism, etc., but it turned the area into, on one hand, an economically growing area of the Van region, and on the other, it started attracting a lot of Armenian pilgrimages that also had some positive impact on nearby areas like Varagavak. But as we know, there was a transformation within Erdogan's thinking. Some would argue it's a personal transformation. Others, like Garo Paylan, a former member of the Turkish parliament who is of Armenian descent, would say it's not a transformation, it's just an opportunist looking for success. The 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, but as well as the rising Kurdish movement the year earlier and the events in Diyarbakir, transformed or allowed Erdogan to be much more openly nationalistic. And a new Erdogan emerged, to the point of him declaring in 2016 for the first time that he is somehow related to someone who fell at Sarikamish. This was not followed by Armenian reporters at the time, but I looked this up a year or two ago when I was writing a piece for Time magazine and saw this weird thing of Erdogan decided that he is somehow related to Sarikamish. As many of us know, Sarikamish was the failed Ottoman campaign against Russians during World War I, which was done up in the high Armenian mountains in very cold season at a time when Ottoman soldiers, including many Armenian Ottoman soldiers, were not properly dressed. And this campaign was led by none other than Enver, the soon-to-be leader, one of the leaders of the Armenian genocide. And Enver, even though he was thankful to Armenian soldiers for their sacrifices, loses the campaign because many of the Turkish, or including Armenian, the Ottoman soldiers die from cold. But as soon as he comes back to Constantinople, he blames the entire defeat on Armenians. Of course, there were obviously Armenians also on the side of the Russians because Armenia was in two parts. But he decides to blame the loss of Sarikamish on Armenians, building ground for the Armenian genocide. And then in 2016, after surviving the attempted coup, Erdogan decides that he is a descendant of one of the fallen soldiers of Sarikamish. He decides that his grandfather, this is according to him, he heard from a story when he visited the area, that locals told him that your grandfather was one of the soldiers here and he died here. So a new narrative starts in Turkey. And there were also other events that we should be mentioning, including in 2020, the Armenian government's declaration that the Sèvres Treaty of 1920, that was a capitulation treaty of Turkey and gave a lot of land to Armenians, that treaty was very relevant, which is a very, very sensitive issue for the Turkish government. And that and other issues pushed the Erdogan government to be much more authoritarian or autocratic, and to have higher security fears. And some people feel that this contributed to his support and his green light and very active participation in the 2020 Azerbaijani war against Artsakh or against Nagorno-Karabakh. But I do want to point out two things: the security issue and the issue of authoritarianism. So my doctoral research introduces something I called sovereign heritage crime. I know it's a mouthful, but as we discussed last time, heritage crime is any deliberate or sometimes even unintentional offenses, whether they're illegal or illicit, toward cultural assets that can include looting, vandalism, forgery, deliberate destruction, etc., etc. So that's a term called heritage crime. But with countries like Azerbaijan, to a degree Turkey, and China, and maybe a few others, we see state actors engaged in deliberate cultural destruction, or to a degree against their own heritage, or heritage on their own territory that they're supposed to protect. So my doctoral thesis, which will come out as a theoretical volume in a book, it's a short volume, but hopefully will have impact on this ongoing conversation. It talks about the sovereign, the state, the actor that's supposed to be the protector of heritage engaging in destruction. And I've identified two components of that. One is security fears or security context. We saw that in Azerbaijan's destruction of Armenian monuments in Nakhchivan following their loss in the Karabakh War. We saw and are seeing that in China with destruction of Uyghur or Uyghur heritage, and we have seen that in different episodes in Turkey concerning Armenian monuments. But much more importantly is perhaps authoritarianism, because anxieties about the history, security-related anxieties, are common throughout conflicts, and they are rather normal. They are to be expected, but we don't see most countries destroy or to systematically eradicate the heritage of the otherized people, or the people who have been construed into an existential threat a political science term for that is called, if they have been securitized, they have been constructed into an ontological or an existential fear. So fears, but also autocracy are important. Now, you may ask, so why are authoritarians much more likely to commit sovereign heritage crime? And some of the obvious answers might be because they're used to violent solutions, that they're used to doing things brutally, etc. And there is some degree of truth to that, but it's a bit more complex and a bit more complicated than that. So obviously, there is there is a natural tendency to have violent solutions. There is a scholar named Clive Foss, and when he talks about destruction of heritage, and especially rewriting of history in post or during and post Ataturk Turkey, he talks about how easy it is for autocrats, how tempting it is to rewrite the past. So there is that personal angle. But when we look, for example, at the timeline of when Azerbaijan engaged in the systematic stages of destruction in Nakhchivan, I have identified two important years. One is 1997, and the other is 2005. And those happen to be the years when Azerbaijan felt most emboldened because of oil deals. So when you are an autocracy and you feel emboldened to get away with any murder, your audience is actually domestic, and this is an insight for an Azerbaijani dissident historian named Arif Yunus. Your target audience is your domestic opposition. You're trying to show that you can literally get away with anything, but it's the resource-enabled evasiveness that allows you to get away. And so it's not just autocracy, it's affluent autocracy. Now, to a degree, Turkey has inspired destruction of Armenian monuments in Nakhchivan, and arguably the ongoing destruction of Armenian monuments in Azerbaijan, the areas that Azerbaijan now controls in Artsakh. But Turkey has not fully destroyed Armenian monuments. And we already mentioned how Akhtamar, even though for political reasons, was renovated by the Erdogan regime, and an older photo of the beautiful cathedral can be seen here. And as you may recall, last time we briefly talked about the importance of the local Kurdish communities, both as stewards and as looters of Armenian heritage. We did end, I think, the last presentation with a slide of the Kurdish Turkish writer Yashar Kemal, who has been credited with stopping the destruction of the church of Akhtamar in the 1950s. Just one more image of the beautiful relief carvings on the outside that are in many ways unmatched even within the rich Armenian architectural heritage. So this is a photo that I took in 2014, but historically less beautiful. But another historic photo is another one I took at the time. And there is something incredible happening here. This is one of the many gift shops around Akhtamar in Turkey. And you may notice that there is a cross on the top of this souvenir, while others do not have it. And this is significant because for some period of time, the Turkish government was refusing to place a cross over Akhtamar, although that changed later on. But much more important than the cross is the spelling of the church. It's actually spelled correctly, whereas the Turkish government uses Akdamar, which is a Turkified, meaning white vein or something like that. But here you have Kurdish shopkeepers who have interacted with pilgrims, Armenian pilgrims, and many, surprisingly, not from the diaspora, but actually from the Republic of Armenia, or diasporans who have gone through an Armenian tour company from Armenia, that as a result of those interactions, they have self-corrected and spelled the name of the church correctly. Now, this is a unique example. You will still see the Turkified spelling throughout the monastery, throughout the region, and of the many gift shops that exist there. But this was particularly striking. That shows the importance of Armenian connections with their sacred sites. Now, there is incredible research that I've tried to summarize in one slide, and then I'll show a few of their examples done by other scholars who have done much more field work that I have done in Turkey. And I do want to summarize it by placing the threads to the remaining Armenian heritage. Of course, as I said earlier, we could spend several hours looking at before and after photos and the heartbreaking imagery of so much of the destruction that has taken place. But I think it's important to be forward-looking, because it's much more important to try to prevent and stop the destruction that's happening right now than to lament the destruction that has already taken place. And that's because much of the destruction is happening right now, today. And the biggest factor in that is looting. As an in-depth article in the Economist reported just last month, which it called an industry, and another piece that I'd actually authored, I called it a looting industrial complex. This industry of looting that's taking place against Armenian sites throughout Turkey, it has happened through the decades, as you saw in the writing of William Dalrymple, but it's much more active today. Some say it's because of COVID, people are bored. Others are saying it's because of the horrible economy that Turkey is in. But as the Economist report documents, it's actually not that lucrative, that they're not really finding a lot of items. So the looting has to be understood beyond plunder, beyond boredom. So there is amazing ongoing research by Steven Sim, the hero of Ani Hovhannisyan's recent PBS documentary. Sim has been visiting Turkey for decades and goes to the most remote areas and is doing this incredible documentation that I hope he will publish one day. Another researcher you should be familiar with, and if not now, then hopefully when he publishes, is Önder Çelik, who recently finished his doctoral program at Johns Hopkins and has an embargo on his dissertation until December. So in about 2 months, we will have a chance to read his very interesting research, the field work that he has done, particularly in the Van area. As a man, as a local, he's been able to blend in and go with looters to Armenian properties, to Armenian sacred sites, and try to understand not so much the thinking of the looters, but the engagement of the Turkish government. Now, here is something that Tamer Akçam and Ümit Kurt have exposed in one of their important books, and that's that the property records from the Armenian genocide, despite being in violation of Turkey's law, have not been publicized to this day. So Turkey has a law requiring that you publish all of your property deeds, except for deeds related to the Armenian genocide, the so-called abandoned properties. Now, Önder Çelik has been tracking the permits that looters get to loot Armenian properties throughout Turkey. We're talking about private properties. And he says that the looting licenses that are being issued by the local Turkish authorities and by the Ministry of Culture, he calls that an alternative archive of the Armenian genocide. So very, very interesting research. Another research by Anush Suni, who's a cultural anthropologist, if I'm not mistaken. She has also spent time doing field work especially with Kurdish populations. And she talks about the complexity of how Kurds see themselves. They see themselves as stewards. They see themselves as looters. Sometimes the looters see themselves as stewards because they will justify this destruction as in their own practice as being much more humane, much more responsible, that they're somehow doing it in better ways than others. So I would recommend that you look up her research as well. Another researcher, Alice von Bieberstein, has also looked at the ongoing destruction and looting of Armenian churches, and she theorizes this through an angle of obsession with the past and sort of an ongoing justification of the Armenian genocide, which I very much agree with, because I argue that the destruction of Armenian heritage in Turkey is sovereign heritage crime by proxy. So the Turkish government is not actively destroying everything, and in fact, some things are being preserved, and we should be encouraging those processes. But allowing for such massive destruction to continue, it's as if it's looking for a post facto legitimization of the Armenian genocide, popularization of the denial, and in some way buying into the public support for its ongoing hostilities, both against Armenians in general, but also the Armenian Republic. Now, so I'll start with theory, mention a little bit more about these other efforts. One, you're probably familiar with research on Armenian architecture that has done this incredible ongoing documentation. You don't hear about a lot of their work sometimes because they're still doing the relentless documentation, looking up new sites that maybe have not been previously documented. Of course, there's also the Hrant Dink Foundation that has the amazing database we talked about last time. We'll look at some of their findings in another slide. There is Aras Sarafian with the Gomedas Institute, who is doing incredible research concerning ongoing efforts to preserve Armenian heritage in Turkey, and we'll talk about his research toward the end. And I also want to mention a not as well-known organization, Hayjar, Association of Architects and Engineers, who have been working on restoring Armenian churches in Turkey since 2007. Now, besides looting, there is also natural disasters that are caused by earthquakes or cattle and wildlife to churches. There's hate crimes by a U.S. organization. We're going to look at their information. And there's obviously also development that's contributing to destruction. Now, the looting, again, is, even though done directly by individuals, there's a lot of government support, or at least malign neglect for it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our final lecture, the third lecture. But I do want to share this interesting research by USERT, which is the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. It's a congressional commission, so it's not a executive branch. It's a legislative branch agency that conducted this research through a private contractor last year about hate crimes against active religious sites in Turkey. And they have shown that there are hate crimes against Alevis, who are the largest minority. They are a Muslim minority in Turkey, that there are ongoing hate crimes against Armenians, Catholics, etc., etc., etc. Now, if you look by absolute numbers, it appears that Alevis and Protestants are the largest recipients of hate crimes. But if you look at numbers per capita, Armenians, and we're talking about Armenian institutions in Istanbul, over the last several years have had the disproportionate number of hate crimes. And that's also true when you compare Armenian institutions to Jewish and Greek Orthodox institutions. and Syriac Orthodox institutions, etc. So this is a very, very concerning trend that the researchers have partly attributed to the 2020 war, etc. Now, I know we're running out of time, so I will try to go a little quicker with the remainder of the slides, but it's important that we also be reminded of the incredible cultural heritage database that the Hrant Dink Foundation has created, documenting not just what remains, but also sites of memory, a lot of sites that have been erased. They have a documentation and mapping of that. Of course, we know that some sites were damaged in last year's earthquake, including the unfortunately named Kurtulush or Liberation Mosque, which is the former Armenian Holy Mother of God, Surpas Patsatzin, in Aintab or Gaziantep, as it's called today, that will be restored, but you can see this destruction that took place. We have images, of course, of those horrible scenes of churches that are barely standing, that may not be saved, but perhaps if the government intervened, they could be conserved to a degree. We had talked about Varagavank, how Armenian pilgrims have been able to protect it to a degree by continuing to visit the area. And now there is a door, and the local Kurdish family is taking care of that. Now, I know we looked at a lot of historical images last time, but there was an important image that I had not showed last time that I wanted to include it today. It's one of the least known sacred sites in modern Turkey, and it's actually the mausoleum of Ashot Voghormats Bagratuni, King Ashot the Merciful, and it was destroyed. Almost nothing remains from the actual grave, although the crumbled structure in the background exists. But I also want to mention something very hopeful that was only rediscovered several years ago by a researcher who happens to also live in the state of Colorado, where I'm based, Jirai Christianian, who through primarily internet and site research rediscovered the Razark, the royal religious mausoleum of Cilician or Kilikian kings and Catholicosoi. So it's now a mosque, but it has at least preserved to a degree of some of the remains of Armenian royalty from the Cilician or Kilikian era. Now, another important organization, Collective 2015, has listed of nearly 100 churches, many of them destroyed, but some are in conditions that are in need of conservation, stabilization, some format of saving. Now, of course, others are barely standing together, and some of them might be even in worse shapes than they are. But I do want to end the presentation with two important slides that are talking about what is being done that can be replicated. Now, this slide is from Turkish Airlines-based promotional video shown on Turkish TV, shared by researcher Ara Sarafian. He just shared this on social media just 2 days ago, and it's showing an Armenian church in Palu that had previously been under a lot of threat. And there's two notable things that Ara notes in a social media post. One, that there is now a fence around it to limit interaction from cattle that scratch themselves against the building and cause more destruction. But also, although it's not a permanent solution, but also try to protect it from looters. But more interestingly and importantly is that this is in a part of Turkey that has been historically very anti-Armenian, that these churches have not even been recognized as Armenian. And it's a Turkish government-owned, well, primarily Turkish government-owned corporation, Turkish Airlines, that it's not known for its pro-Armenian policy, that is actually doing this. Now, some will say too little, too late, that it's, token propaganda, etc. But a lot of this mini preservation efforts are because of people like Aras Sarafian and the other researchers and many others that I have not named who go to Turkey, spend time there, speak with local officials. Oftentimes, they'll never bring up the Armenian genocide because they're not there to cause more trouble. They're there to do what is possible. They're there to try to preserve and safeguard what remains, to try to stop the looting, which is much more important at this moment than talking about the destruction that has happened, because much more destruction is happening today. I'll just mention one fact before moving on to the last slide, and that is according to one of the major looters of Turkey, and we'll talk about the particular criminal in our next lecture, said a few years ago that by his estimate, there are 4 million treasure hunters or looters throughout the Turkish Republic. So we're talking about a massive population that's engaged in this destruction. And the people on the ground, both Armenian pilgrims and scholars, locals, especially Kurds, but also prominent Turks like Osman Kavala, have played an important role. Osman Kavala is the founder of Anadolu Kultur, Anatolian Culture, this very important nonprofit that has been advocating for preservation of Ani. And by the way, there's an incredible documentary by Arte that came out a little over a week ago. It's on YouTube. It's a German-French production, but it's in English with some Armenian and some Turkish, but English subtitle. Osman Kavala's story is also mentioned in there. This man is now in prison for life because Erdogan has declared him an enemy of the state, accused him of having been some of the masterminds of the alleged coup. And that's very concerning because the most of the work that Osman Kavala has done has been toward preserving Armenian culture. And despite his imprisonment, his organization is still active. People still work there, and they still try to find common ground with both this nationalist government in Turkey, but also Armenian stakeholders who are willing to leave no stone unturned in making sure that whatever remains of Turkey's Armenian heritage can still be preserved. And when we meet next and last time to discuss this topic, we will be looking at very specific ways in which we, as researchers, as community members, as stakeholders of this important heritage, can have our own impact on saving of what remains of Turkey's material Armenian past. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And again, I apologize for not being able to speak with you here in person, but I'm looking forward to your questions. And I believe that I'll have to read the questions because of the audio. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time to type your question. I'm looking forward to reading it. I will read it out loud so that the audience can hear it before I respond. And the question is, are any of the sites protected by UNESCO or other agencies? Which is a great question. As we know, UNESCO is the UN educational, scientific, cultural organization which works with member states when it comes to monitoring and preservation of cultural sites. And thankfully, Ani is officially a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and others like Ahtamar have been nominated as well to be official UNESCO sites by the Turkish government. But what we have to understand that international organizations, well, UNESCO is more specifically an interstate organization, it's made of state actors, that interstate organizations particularly, but also all international organizations have to a degree cooperate with the local authority. So they're not allowed to independently work. And that's why their work is limited by what the Turkish government allows them to do. Fortunately, World Monuments Fund, which is another organization that has done ongoing survey in the Ani region, has found a way to do some work in Ani, and UNESCO has been involved in Ani, etc. But there are competing narratives. So if you watch the Arte documentary, you have two archaeological crews in Ani. The main one, the official one, basically is trying to downplay the importance of the Armenian site. And then you have the one that's supported by the nonprofits, and it's the one that started when Erdogan was much more open about preserving Armenian culture, whereas so you have those two different competing narratives. So there is not involvement by UNESCO or others, unfortunately, to protect the sites that are being heavily looted. And there have been some movements, whereas the Armenian Patriarchate has been asked to claim re-ownership of those lands so that it can get involved with the monitoring, but it does not have the resources, and it's very careful not to upset the Turkish government. You have the Hijar organization that I mentioned that's trying to be more proactive. You have Armenians in Diyarbakir or Tigranakert trying to do some things, and there's an incredible example of them actually winning a small grant from the Turkish government for renovation of Surpsakis, which was just announced a few weeks ago, and then they have taken it to the Patriarchate and invited them to get involved. So every side has required some sort of initiative by either local or outside Armenian groups and local allies, with the exception of Ahtamar, which was Erdogan's pet project in the beginning. But unfortunately, there is no centralized effort for an international organization to get engaged in the monitoring. And I think it would happen only if there was some more advocacy, and perhaps by the Armenian government itself. And I'm saying this only because there is a better mechanism for protecting Georgian churches in Turkey, and that has only happened after an agreement was made between the Turkish and the Georgian governments, which can be something to replicate, as opposed to relying on international organizations that have very limited resources, even if the Turkish government agreed to cooperate with them. Thank you for your question. I'll take the next question if it can be typed. I appreciate you taking the time to type the question. And the question is, do you think if the border between Armenia and Turkey are open, there may be help to preserve the churches? I think that is a wonderful question, and the answer I think has to be a yes, only because we have seen where there is an effort by Armenian researchers and pilgrims to visit churches and establish relationships with locals, that there have been better preservations of those sites. And, we have seen that in, Ara Sarafian's ongoing work, that he very patiently engages the very nationalist Turkish authorities in areas where there have been particularly hostile toward Armenians. We've also seen in some of the areas where Armenian pilgrims have left positive impact. However, I want to mention that sort of the statist ideas for preservation can also be somewhat dangerous, especially if they're simply political. As you may recall, Armenia and Turkey announced that they will be rebuilding the Ani Bridge across Ahurian that would connect modern Turkey and modern Armenia through the historical site of Ani. So if that rebuilding is done from a scholarly perspective, and I'm repeating the research of Steven Sim, the architectural historian of the region, he says that actually a lot of destruction will happen if that renovation takes place, because it would require movement of equipment through other archaeological sites that are threatened. So some statist projects may inadvertently contribute to more destruction, even if they're supposed to restore some monuments. So that threat always exists. But there is going to be primarily benefits if Armenians start visiting. However, there's one component we have heard from so many researchers and visitors that often the treasure hunters or the looters will follow Armenian pilgrims and then actually ask them if they're willing to share information about hidden treasure, or actually revisit the areas that they have gone to and start digging in those areas. So there's also the threat of more Armenian visitations being followed by looters. But I think on average, the result will be more positive. And we have also seen that indirectly in what happened in Nakhichevan, where the entire Armenian historical landscape has been leveled, not even to rubble. There is not even any dust remains. And this is incredible, the level of destruction. It has not happened anywhere else in the world, this level of complete erasure. Well, the destruction in Nakhichevan started exactly 10 years after no Armenians were allowed to visit the area, and still to this day, no Armenian is allowed to visit Nakhichevan despite their citizenship. And a lot of the destruction in Turkey in the earlier decades happened in a similar period where Armenians were not allowed to visit Turkey. That has obviously changed. And so that segregation between visitors, the pilgrims, and researchers and their sacred sites has demonstratively contributed to destruction. I also realize there's other issues with opening the border, economic ones, but I'm not an economist, so those are not issues that I could comment on. But on average, the preservation of churches would benefit from more open borders. I see a question. I don't know if I should read it or are we taking more questions? Okay, so the question is, how much faith do we have in UNESCO in preserving the cultural sites? I think it's a great question, and this is where I'm going to be less diplomatic. And by we, I mean people who are researchers and people who care about these monuments. We should not rely on third parties to care more about our heritage than we do. We should leave no stone unturned in doing everything to stop the looting that's happening and preserve and conserve whatever is still remains. And this is true for both Armenian heritage under Turkey's control and both for Armenian heritage under Azerbaijan's control. I think there is a fine line from having rights, which everyone has cultural rights, to claiming agency and demonstrating responsibility. And as much as Armenians have been victimized and are being victimized in this process, victims have agency. And claiming that agency can take many forms. Those of us who are able to go be on the ground, build those long-term relationships, do our best, we should. Others, as scholars, are engaged. There's many, who are doing incredible work, including Christina Maranzi, Hevmar Wattenpar, Rachel Goshkarian. These are scholars who do field work in Turkey, and there, and many, many, many others who are doing incredible work in trying to have positive impact. I think these individuals are, and many others, and others I've mentioned, are doing much more important work than UNESCO even can. So even if UNESCO were allowed to do more work, it does not have the resources and it does not have the motivation. This is something that impacts Armenians as the most important stakeholders much more than anyone else. It also impacts Kurds or Turks, even if they may have anxieties, security fears, and hatred toward the monuments. Engagement with them and with those sites can de-securitize, and this is what my doctoral thesis argues, that we need to de-securitize heritage. We need to de-securitize the material past. And the more you demonstrate your good faith relation to those monuments, that you're not there for treasure, you're not there for territorial claims, you're there because you're not claiming that those monuments belong to you. You're claiming that you belong to those monuments. I think the more Armenian stakeholders think along those lines, that's going to be more important than relying on organizations like UNESCO. Okay, so question about Osman Kavala. Does his work still exist? Is it continuing? Yes. So Anadolu Kultur, which is the organization that Osman Kavala has founded, it still functions. They're not as active as they used to be. They have to be very careful. It's very dangerous to work for an organization that's founded by someone, who's now considered a traitor, but who should really be hailed as a hero. So it exists. I, encourage watching the documentary I referenced earlier on Arte. It's on YouTube. Maybe I can very quickly tell you the exact title so that you'll have an easier time looking it up. It's called, the actual document is called The Ruins of Ani, but to Google it, it's called Turkey/Armenia Peace in Ruins, question mark. So it was published 9 days ago, and along with many other stakeholders, it talks about Osman Kavala''s work. So, just imagine the person who has done probably more than any other Turk for Armenian heritage in Turkey is now in prison for life. And I would want to draw a parallel with his Azerbaijani intellectual named Akram Aylisli, much older. He also is under house arrest, and he had done something similar. He protested the destruction of Armenian monuments in Nakhichevan. He was unable to stop the destruction, but he wrote a very courageous book, Stone Dreams, about the monuments that validates the history, that memorializes those stones. And I want us to also know his name, Akram Aylisli, because there's the Envers and Talyats and Aliyevs, and there are Osman Kavala's and Akram Aylisli's. And if we want to have positive impact for peace and for preservation, we should celebrate, uplift people like Osman Kavala and Akram Aylisli, even though they're effectively, both of them have been shut down by the dictatorships in which they live. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bermagerdician, Professor Zakarian, and audience, and everyone. I appreciate it.